Hello everyone, it's the Preacher coming at you today with my new episode, the new series I'm making called Confirming the Bible, which will be airing mostly on Tuesdays from now on. And the whole idea of the series is that many people have issues with the Bible, either contradictory or something about morality or some other issue. So I would like to go through the Bible, take certain issues that people have with it, and answer them in the most educated way I could. So today's episode is about slavery. Now, the very definition of a slave is someone who is an indebted worker, or someone working to pay off a debt. So the issue that many people have with slavery is that they don't understand that there's different types of slavery. For example, what America, along with many other countries, did to Africa is not quite slavery. Although it did become called slavery, by definition it wasn't, because the Africans did not owe us a debt. We just made them work because they were there. So this idea of working off a debt is not particularly a bad thing. In fact, we still use slavery to some degree for a lot of reasons. You know, if you go into a restaurant and you eat this big meal and you don't have money to pay for the bill, they'll probably make you work it off, which makes sense. You owe them money, you can't pay it, so you work it off. It's simple logic to follow. Same thing with prisoners. Prisoners typically have to work after they get arrested. They owe a debt to society, so they work to pay it off. Quite easy to follow. And so this type of slavery, a slave being someone trying to work off a debt, is not particularly bad. Now, it can be bad, but in the most cases it is not, and is in fact pretty helpful in most societies. For example, in most African nations, they could not take slaves of native people. They would have to take slaves from other clans or other tribes that attacked them, and even those people's kids could be free, that they were automatically free once they were born. And it was even better in Israel in the biblical times, because how the slavery worked was that there's two types of slaves. There was native slaves and foreigner slaves. And how you became a native slave was you owed someone a debt, and so you went to him or her and said, you know, I owe you a debt, I can't pay it off, so I will work for you for a certain amount of time. And, you know, the man will say, yes, that works fine. So you work for him for so many years until your debt is paid off. And at the end of that time, either one of two things will happen. Either one, you'll be released and, you know, off you go and you can go back to your families and back to your jobs and whatever. Or two, you can actually decide to stay with your master. And I know many people are saying, why would you do that? Because you see, unlike what we are taught slavery is today, slavery in Israel was taking care of your slaves. That if you had a slave, you gave him food, and you gave him water, and you gave him shelter and clothing, and even his children and his entire family got this stuff. That being a slave wasn't a bad thing. It was just you fell in hard times, so you had to work to pay things off, and your master had the respect and the law to abide by to give you basic needs, and even go a step further than that and give you clothing, like new clothing every year, you know, give your children and entire family clothing every year. And if you did come to like your master, they can make you a slave for life, but it was by your own choice. So that's how the native slavery worked. Foreigner slaves typically came from fighting, from wars of some kind, or they could come and work here by choice. I guess that could happen. So when the Bible talks about slavery, because the issue here isn't whether the Bible talks about slavery, because it does. The issue is, does the slavery that the Bible talk about good slavery? So let's look here. That a big chapter for this is found in Exodus 21, and that's where it talks a lot about, you know, a lot about slavery in general. And I know the very first one can be found in Exodus 21:2-6. I'm looking up right now. And what it deals about is that it deals with how you should treat both normal slaves, like native slaves, and foreigner slaves. It says, if thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the seventh he shall go free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, and the wife of her children shall be the master's, and he shall go out by himself. And if a servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, he will not go out free. Then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through an ale, and he shall serve him forever. So basically it's saying, if there is a native slave, he will serve for 6 years, and on the 7th year he is allowed to go free. And if you did not have to bring him by force, aka by the law had to force him in there, he was allowed to basically do whatever, just work at this time, and for the rest of the time just go out and do whatever. You can be married, you can have kids, yada yada yada. I know many people say it's odd that if his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. Now, I know many people find this odd to say, like, why would the law say that you have to keep the son and wife with the master? Well, the issue here is that if you do not love your children or wife enough to stay behind, then you probably don't need them. And as I've said, that these people worked for 6 years, that after that time, who knows what job they find, who knows what they do. It doesn't particularly say that this man could care for his family after this. So that's another big issue. I know after that, it does talk in Exodus 21. Actually, I'm going to skip over to Leviticus 25, which is another big chapter for talking about slavery in the Bible. And it's 25:44. And this one explains how foreigner slavery should work. It says, both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Of them shall ye buy bondmen and bondmaids. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession. So, in this case, it says that, an actual slave comes from the people around you, from the nations around you. And many people will say, this does show some racism because it is going against certain tribes, certain clans. But the issue here is that these nations hated Israel. If you just read through Exodus, if you read through the story, the majority of the countries or the nations they went through hated them, and they tried to destroy them. And these people, if a foreigner comes and tries to kill you and your nation, you're allowed to take them and hold them, and you should be allowed to make them work for you. If you try to destroy a nation, then that nation is allowed to imprison you. So they became either slaves, or they could die with the rest of them with execution, just for trying to attack this nation and trying to destroy it. But also, you find that in this section, it does talk about more of the children, the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession. So basically, the issue that people have here is that they say that this is kind of horrible to make these people just become slaves forever. But once again, talking about the children of the native people, the foreign people typically taught their kids to hate Israel. If you became a slave, it was typically by choice that you chose to be a slave. you chose to attack Israel, and if you get caught, you could decide to die. You could be executed if you wanted to be, but you could also live on as a slave, which is a fine choice. If you want to live on as a slave and live your life like that, you can. So it does talk about that in a big part, and I feel that that is what Leviticus is specifically talking about. If you read through it, talking about their possessions and your possessions, so that does kind of show that when it talks about this, it does show that it is referring mostly to prisoners of some kind of war, most likely, because it does say in Exodus 21:16 that it was illegal to go out and just take someone and force him to be a slave. So it does kind of imply that you have to have, to some degree, a choice of whether you want to be a slave. So going back to Exodus 21, and this time it's Exodus 21:7. It says, "If a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as menservants do. If she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. To sell her unto a strange nation he shall have no power, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. And if he hath betrothed her unto his son, and he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters, if ye take him another wife, or food, or raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And if ye do these three unto her, then shall she go out free without money." So basically, a lot of people say that this is referring to sex slaves, and I've seen that used a lot. That when it talks about a maid servant, if she pleases not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself. But the issue here is that talking about please, it's typically not talking about sexual matters. In fact, the Bible does not use please or pleasure in any way relating to sexual matters. And it's basically just saying, if you have a woman servant and, you're not unhappy with her, don't just, kick her out. Don't just be like, get out, because women at that time would have issues with providing for herself, because the majority of the men was the ones who worked. So it says that, if you are truly unhappy with a maidservant, try to find a man to provide for her. Try to give her food and raiment and shelter. Try to provide these things for her as long as you can. And at the end of the day, if you don't, if you are holding something back from her, just let her go. It's basically commanding that if you have a maidservant, then try to treat her better than the majority of the people, because she couldn't provide for herself at this time. I know another big issue that people have comes from Exodus 21:20, which says, and if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall be surely punished. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. So it's basically saying that you can punish your servants by rod hitting, by hitting them. A lot of people say that this is horrible, that this is abusive, but it's not necessarily true. It specifically says that you can hit someone to punish them, as long as you, if you don't kill them, and if they're okay afterwards, go ahead. Because, as I've said, that this does refer to foreigners, because it does say over in Leviticus that bondmen and bondmaids should come specifically from foreign nations, that you should see every Hebrew slave as just a hired servant. So once again, this is a war criminal who you are giving him a house, giving him clothing, giving him food and water and shelter, and you are not killing him. He chose to be a servant. If he messed up, then he should be punished to some degree. Now, you can say that, beating is a bad punishment, but what other punishment would you have at this time? There's nothing else you could give unto him. You couldn't really dock his pay. He's a servant. You can't really take food or water away, because that's the law and it's what's required to give unto a servant. So hitting was typically the way to punish people, and it did work. It shows that physical punishments typically work better than anything else. So, at the end of this, I do want to show that in the New Testament, in the book of Philemon, it does talk about Paul sending this letter to a man by the name of Philemon concerning a runaway slave of his. And this is also used a lot of times to show how the Bible supports slavery, and how, because Paul says accept him back, that, the New Testament talks about slavery. But even if you look in Philemon, it says, Philemon 1:15, it says, "For perhaps he therefore departed for a season, and thou shouldst receive him forever, not now as a servant, but above a servant, a brother beloved, specially to me, but how much more unto thee, both in the flesh and in the Lord? If thou count me therefore a partner, receive him as myself." So Paul is basically telling Philemon, is like, I'm sending this slave back to you for you to see him not as a slave, but as a brother. And Paul even goes on to say that, in fact, don't just see him as a brother, see him like me. If I was your servant, Paul talking about himself, like, if I, Paul, was your servant, how would you treat me? And that's how I want you to treat him. So even in Philemon, it talks about there are servants, but treat them with brotherly love. And I know at the end of the day, many people will say, oh, but during the Civil War in the South and all of that, people used the Bible to push slavery all the time. And to that I say, what people say is in the Bible and what's in the Bible is typically two completely different things. As I've shown in Philemon, it specifically talked about, treat your servants with brotherly love. In the Old Testament, it specifically said, give them food, payment. I think it was two changes of clothes each year, which was pretty nice at that time. Food, water, clothing, shelter for him and his entire family. You couldn't kill him. You had to provide for him. You had to treat him like a human being that was just your servant. And it was a little bit worse, of course, for the war criminals, but they decided to be a slave. They could easily choose to not, act out and not be a slave and be executed. So this is my take on slavery in the Bible, that the slavery that Israel had at that time was purely indebted servitude. It was the natives trying to work off debt, or it was war criminals who was trying to pay off their servitude to Israel because they lost the war. Even in Philemon, it does talk about brotherly love. And people who use the Bible to push ahead slavery and racism and everything else like that has clearly not read it, because it specifically says to treat these people like human beings, to treat them like they're one of your own. So I have more in this issue, but I'll talk about it in a future episode, perhaps one of the upcoming answering atheisms about what good Christianity has done to the world, and specifically what has Christianity done about the issue of bad slavery in the world. But until that time, thanks for watching. Like, favorite, subscribe, leave a comment if you have something to say or to ask. Come back for more. All my contact information is down below. I have a Twitter, I have an email, I have a blog that I try to hit up about a few times a week. So until next time, thanks for watching, guys. Bye.